In the 100th year of its founding, it's only fitting that there is curiosity about its founder, Dr. Keshav Balliram Hedgewar. A new biography promises to shed new light on his life and views, and perhaps also on the RSS. For decades, Hedgewar has been cast as a dark lord, a bigot, fascist, casteist patriarch that founded a dangerous and subversive secret society in his own image. Is this really true? Or has Hedgewar been a victim of, and mind the pun, a historian's pen? Let's speak to Sachin Nandha on his new book, simply titled Hedgewar. And here it is in all its glory, published by Penguin, a tome. It's fashionable now to write a tome, isn't it? But look, a biography is only good as its sources. Why do you think this is a credible work and not an attempt at whitewashing Hedgewar and showing him in a benign light?
Great. Well, firstly, thank you for having me on your show, and it's a real pleasure to be here and share some of the ideas and stories behind this biography. So let me first, at the offset, kind of say, this was not a kind of a weekend project, right? I mean, this took me 7 years to write, and of course, by training, I should also confess that I'm not a historian, right? I'm a philosopher. My training is in philosophy. I have a background in comparative religion. But nevertheless, I felt my curiosity is what led me into this, actually. That's number one. Number two is what it was. I came to realize very early on that everybody has an opinion on the RSS in this country. Everybody. I was raised in the UK. I live in the UK. And so when I used to come to India initially just for backpacking trips and then for business, I began to realize that RSS was everywhere. In every nook and cranny, it's kind of woven into the social fabric of the society. Whether people know that or not, it's there. And I kept on bumping into it in different forms. So I began to ask questions. People had opinions, lots of opinions, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But when I would scratch those opinions, I found that they knew very little. So I began to read literature. And let me say that, when I came across the RSS literature, I found them unpalatable, right? They were hagiographies. They were not biographies, or they were not historical documents per se. They were written for a different audience, different time maybe. But they were not palatable to me. They were not credible. It was window dressing. Then I went to the academic world. And, Christoph Jeffrelow's mammoth work on Hindu nationalism was my topographical map originally in terms of how do I navigate the space. But what I quickly realized was that the academy in this country also didn't really have any direct access to the RSS source material. They were all using secondary and tertiary material, and then it was kind of like a literary vortex. They were all quoting each other, but nobody had really gone to the source. And so I started to, say, well, this is not credible on either side. So who is the real Hedgewar, right? And my view is, and it became more and more clear the more I visited this country, that if you want to understand modern India, you have to confront and face up and understand the RSS. And where better place to start than the founder? And there was nothing much on the founder. So it was that gap that I tried to fill, number one. Number two is then, as I started to complain about the literature, it was quite a senior RSS pracharak that I met at several conferences who said, well, look, you've been complaining about this long enough. If you think you can do better, why don't you do it? So I laughed it off, obviously. I mean, but he was serious. And just to test that seriousness, I kind of said, well, I don't have any access to source material, and I live 5,000 miles away. How is this possible? And, credit where credit is due. He gave me access. And before you knew it, I had to pinch myself because I was beginning to get access to material that I knew not very many people had access to, both in Delhi, in Nagpur. Of course, the British Library is fantastic at this stuff. really good. There were some documents in Paris, and then there were some documents in Delhi at what was called the NMML library there. So, but the source was his actual notes and letters and what have you. And then, of course, there was a Marathi translation by a man called Nana Palkar, who himself was a Pacharak, written back in the 60s and 70s. It was in Marathi. So that was translated, which then I could use, again, as a topographical map, knowing that it's window dressing. So one has to then kick the tires and verify all the rest of it. It took 7 years for this reason.
So you went to primary sources.
Absolutely. Wherever I could, I went to the primary sources because I just knew that.
And did something surprise you? Were your views suddenly altered on Hedgewar and how he looked at the world and what some of the other people seemed to suggest that, he was?
So I have to.
Or is?
I started off this journey as I would consider, healthy skeptic. That's how I started this journey off, that I was a healthy skeptic. And as I said, reading Christoph Jeffrelow's work inevitably gave me that critical mind. As I went on this journey, I became increasingly sympathetic, right? I became increasingly sympathetic towards Hedgewar, and therefore, by definition, extension of it to his creation. But certainly towards Hedgewar, his mind, his philosophy. He was a man of his times, and his times built him. Right? He didn't sit under a tree and just came up with this stuff. It's a pretty nuanced idea, or a set of ideas. So in that sense, that was my journey. So today I would say, I sympathetically look at Hedgewar, or what I call Hedgewarianism.
So let me ask you, because one of the things that is said about the RSS is that this is a Hindu nationalist, and you've sort of made references to it, Brahminical patriarchy. And it was founded in the vision of Hedgewar himself, and perhaps shaped by his own image. How accurate is this labeling?
It's false. It really is false. And it's false because anybody that writes this and believes this immediately tells me, maybe no fault of their own, but they've never had access to his source material.
So what part of it is false? Is it the fact that it's not a Brahminical organization as people have sort of defined it? Is it not nationalist? Is it not patriarchal? There aren't many women, for example, that define the RSS in senior positions. So how does one sort of...
Yeah. So if you will allow, I'll just kind of dissect some of these themes that you've picked up. The thing that I recognize about the RSS and Hedgewar in particular is that Hedgewar's life can be split into 3 compartments, if I may. The first element is his early life, up to him graduating as a medical doctor. That life is very much about tragedy. It's about struggle. It's about huge emotional loss. It's about he understood by the time he came out of university that India was decrepit. Indian society had hit an all-time low. I mean, let's just put some stats on this, right? 10% of males in India could read or write. Only 1% of women could read and write, right? So it's a highly illiterate society, number one. And so he was deeply aware that Indian society had hit an all-time low. Second thing is that the second compartment is that he comes out of university, and during his young student days, he was a radical. He was part of the struggle, part of the independence struggle. He was part of all the revolutionary secret societies of Bengal and Maharashtra. He was, again, this bit is often never mentioned. Even though Hedgewar was orphaned at the age of 12, which is a tragedy, of course, and the psychological trauma he must have gone through. The other side of that coin is that he was picked up and adopted by Dr. Munjay. Dr. Munjay was one of the wealthiest men in Nagpur, a surgeon and an ex-British military officer. So suddenly Hedgewar goes from being this 12-year-old in a lower working, middle-class, sort of conservative Brahmin family to this ultra-modern, English-speaking, English-educated elite family. And suddenly he has access to the who's who, access to education, access to English. And so Hedgewar also had an elite education, but he was infused with a radical, revolutionary form of nationalism. That's the first phase. Second phase is he realizes that actually violence is not what's going to defeat the British. Violence was never going to do it. It may play some role on the periphery, but the core, if India was to really push the British out, it was going to have to be some other way. And the only other major story at that time was Congress, the Indian National Congress, right? And so he joined, and he was part of the Indian National Congress, of course, because his father figure, Munjay, was a very senior leader in that movement. And so naturally, he got involved in the Congress, and he became a very good and successful mid-level sort of functionary worker. And that's his political awareness, awakening, if you will. But he realized something, that between 1921, let me start again, 1918 to about 1921, 1922, he starts actually realizing that after World War I, the British Empire was on the retreat. It was almost bankrupt. And he had known, as did many other leaders at that time, that actually it's a matter of when the British will leave, or the British will have to let go of India, not if. Yeah. So he knew that. He began to realize that actually the problem with India, and this is a key bit again people don't talk about, his major critique was not the British or the Mughals or anyone else. His major critique was of the Hindu society. And he realized that the problem with Indian society, first and foremost, was the Hindu society had become fossilized through caste, and that caste basically almost froze social mobility. And without social mobility, you can't get innovation. And so without innovation, everything else collapses in a society over time. So he recognized this. And he then realized that capturing the state when the British leave is not going to reform this society. This society needed to rebuild itself from the grassroots and up. So the third phase of his life is the RSS, 1925 to 1940. So he was only alive for 15 years, the early part of the RSS. And so that third part really is phenomenal. When I say phenomenal, I mean it in the sense of a social reformer. Whether you like him, whether you disagree with him or what, that's by the by. I mean, just study the man's ideas and his way in which he organized the movement, his creation. Just a few points on that. First is, he differentiated between political nationalism and cultural nationalism. No doubt about that. The Congress, Savarkar, Bose, Patel, Ambedkar, these were all nationalists, as was Hedgewar. But they were all political nationalists. What I mean by political nationalism, what he meant by political nationalism was, these were people who believed that the Rajya was the most important thing to grab in order to transform the society. Hedgewar recognized, and I think he was the only one of his time, who recognized that that's wrong. That's the wrong premise. The actual premise is there is Rashtra, nation. The nation is real, and the Rajya is imaginary. So the Rajya will come second. You have to first sort the Rashtra out in order to fix the Rajya. So he decides to give up power, and he had the opportunity to be a very senior congressman. Nehru's father came to visit Hedgewar to effectively say, look, why don't you join me, and I can take you to the top. He rejects that offer. He ends up going into the unknown, a path less trodden, and he sets up the RSS because he was adamant that, again, the problem with India was the Hindu society. And somehow we had to fix what that was. And so he became a cultural nationalist. And so that cultural nationalism is where you recognize that the Rashtra is real. And so he wanted to fix that.
What aspects of his legacy have been vandalized, do you think? Let's just build on the conversation we began, because I'm looking now at specifics. People have said that wasn't much of a freedom fighter. The RSS distanced itself from the freedom struggle. Others have said it remains one of those paternalistic organizations, and we haven't still sort of gone into that. And there was, of course, a complete Brahminical tint to the whole organization.
Yeah, let's tackle that. I
Yeah.
think these are great questions, and I
Yes.
think very, very worthy of exploration. So I explore almost all of those in this book, albeit because you have to cover them as you travel through his life. So a couple of things. So let's just kind of go into that. What Hedgewar realized was cultural nationalism was the key bit. So he recognized that what today you and I would call it social capital, right? What Robert Putnam calls social capital, which is effectively where individuals have to have a sense of trust, a surplus of trust. When you have a surplus of trust and commitment towards one another, only then you can start building communities and societies. And so what he had recognized was that Indian society, and particularly the Hindu society, didn't really have social capital. Or what social capital it had was very low, i.e. there was no trust amongst the Indians themselves. And so he wanted to build a mechanism that creates trust. So absolutely correct in the analysis that when Hedgewar started off, he came from a particular community, which was Brahmin. In fact, specific Brahmins, the Deshishta Brahmins. My pronunciation may be a bit off, but that's what it was. So inevitably, his creation is rooted in that soil, because that's the soil he came from, and that's perfectly human, perfectly natural. But the intention of the man is very clear in what he says, in what he wrote, which is that, and what he did, which is that we must build social capital amongst all Indians. And therefore, if India is to really be a Rashtra, then that Rashtra must go beyond class, creed, and caste. So caste was something he was abhorrent against. And right the way till his life, 15 years, he kept on absolutely emphasizing over and over again of castelessness within the
This is true
RSS.
of most of the RSS and some of its ideologues, but never really talked about. Why do you think this got obscured?
I think, look, I confess that I do not understand the modern political landscape of India, right? It's not my forte, I can't comment on it. But what I suspect has happened is that somewhere along the lines, India, for better or wrong, right, is not my issue, but it is rooted, caste is so ingrained in the Indian society, has been for so long, and has done so much damage, so much harm, that I think from a Hedgewarian perspective, caste has to go. Lock, stock, and barrel. They are his words, not mine. Lock, stock, and barrel is what he said. The caste has to go, has to be removed. But I think the approach that he took, and I think, is that it's not a revolutionary approach. It's an evolutionary approach. What he created, what he realized was if you allow human beings, nodes, i.e., places, physical places, where people can mix, people can eat together, play together, talk together, right? And you leave your caste out, i.e., you break that barrier. When human beings mix with each other, they start building social capital. And once you build enough social capital, you tip and you become friends, and you become family, and you intermarry, you end endogamy.
And how did he do this?
Shaka.
And was there a backlash?
So Hedgewar was incredibly unpopular amongst his own community when he started this.
Like Savarkar was.
Like Savarkar was, and like many others who are trying to reform, are always opposed, right? Because they're doing something against the status quo.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge admirer of the fact that he had the courage to step out. And let's just tackle this Brahmin issue. So the early Swayamsevaks, the early Swayamsevaks, were indeed Brahmins. But they came from that community from which he came, and his influence was in that community. So naturally, that's where the social capital was. So he leveraged that social capital to set this up. But if you look at what happened in the 15 years he was alive, very quickly the RSS spreads across North India pretty much rapidly. And in there, we absolutely know that the Swayamsevaks were from all castes, all backgrounds. Very many Muslims also were but there, joining part of the RSS. Understanding something, that the RSS's red lines and Hedgewarian red lines are not around religion. This is I would say, intellectual vandalism, right? It's intellectual vandalism. Hedgewar's red line was Deshbhakti. Now, Deshbhakti is not patriotism. Patriotism implies, again, back to political nationalism, I want to capture the state in order to do what's right, whatever I think is right. Cultural nationalism is not that. Cultural nationalism is about bringing people together on a shared journey, a shared history, a shared philosophy. Now, Desh Bhakti is that which literally means I am one with the soil, literally. And that bhav, that spirit comes in the people. The RSS is an engine that produces social capital, relationships, trust, rooted in the love of the soil. Now, that means that whatever the soil produces is yours. Trees, rivers, the environment, animals, also people. Now, whether those people worship a Buddha or an Allah or a Christ or a Krishna, it does not matter to Hedgewar, Hedgewarianism. Hedgewar's edifice, the red line that he would not cross, and by the way, that is a problem still today, is that, and people may express it differently, I express it this way, that the red line is Desh Bhakti. Now, the challenges that India faces is that, again, it's not very well written and not much spoken about. So let me share this with you. In 1918, when World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire was on the losing side, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved and the seat of the Caliph was taken away.
Yes.
What we don't appreciate in this country, and historians have never spoken much about, is that it caused a crisis of faith within Islam. A deep crisis of faith across the Islamic world. And for the first time in 1400 years, Islam didn't have a caliph. And so there were, broadly speaking, three buckets in which Islam fell. Those who said Islam was the problem, get rid of it. They became Ataturk and the secularists. There were those who said Islam is fine, but let's modernize it. Let's kind of adopt science and technology and blah, 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 and let's modernize it. That was the Ba'athist parties and the nationalists, the Arab nationalists. And then in India, you had the conservative orthodoxy being produced, the Deobandi Islam, which basically said the problem with Islam is not that we've been corrupted, is that we're not Muslim enough. We need to go back to the Rashidin, right? The rightly guided ones. That's the 7th century. And so India takes on a very conservative, orthodox Islam. Now, in that Islam, anybody who studied theology will tell you this. It's not rocket science. It's that nationalism, any form of nationalism, cultural or political, is a idolatry.
Yeah. It's a variance with the fundamentals.
Right. And so suddenly you had a whole memes were created, ideas were created within the Muslim world that you can't be a nationalist, right? You have to fight for a pan-Islamic movement. You can't be a nationalist for India because that would be idolatry, right? So, and now that creates a red line. Because for Hedgewarianism, for the RSS, the early RSS, the red line is not your religion. It's are you a Deshbhakt? So from the RSS perspective, the Hedgewarian perspective, let me be more precise, Hedgewarian perspective, you can practice any faith you like, so long as your trust and your social capital is rooted to this land. And ultimately, whether you're a businessman or you're a farmer or you're a politician, your ultimate allegiance is to the people and the things of this land. Now that's Desh Bhakti. For Muslims in India, the clerics, and I don't mean the common Muslim, I'm talking about the clerical class.
We need to make that distinction.
Yeah, the clerical class. Yeah. The clerical class started teaching in Islam that basically said, here is a red line, that idolatry is bad. Now, how do you cross this bridge?
It's true.
I don't know. I don't think anybody else has figured it out.
Do you think it's still sort of irreconcilable?
No, I actually believe that if you were to ask other types of Muslims, for example, Hanbali Islam, or Hanbali, Hanafi Islam, yes. You would find that for them, it would be a lot more comfortable being a nationalist, being a Deshbhakt, and a Muslim. So this is a particular form of Islam which stops this conversation from happening, right? So you've got two groups who have two red lines. Now I think it can be crossed, it can be traversed, but here we are.
So did his approach to this sort of syncretism that you sort of refer to loosely, founded on Desh Bhakti, has it continued to, at some level, have a lasting impact on the RSS, or has it sort of withered away in the current context? You do hear of people saying that the RSS is becoming more exclusivist and so on and so forth. And, there are all sorts of conversations that take place, let's say, around the Waqf board or Aurangzeb or the Ram Temple movement or this, that, the other, which sort of cast the RSS in this sort of Hindu nationalist fold, not a cultural nationalist fold. And you have, of course, somebody like the current RSS chief, Mr. Bhagwat, who's trying to sort of allay those fears about the RSS. So what do you think has happened? I mean, how would Hedgewar look at the RSS of today? Would it be closer to what he imagined it would be in its ideological outlook? Or do you believe that the RSS is course corrected, went through a certain chicane where it became a little more for the purposes of trying to reach out to a huger number of people, etc., went through a slightly more exclusivist phase with the Ram Temple movement, and now is sort of coming back and reconciling with Hedgewarism?
I think, look, because I'm not an expert and I don't follow Indian political movements,
so let me just ask you, do you think the RSS of today would be more agreeable to Hedgewar as it has evolved?
Well, honestly speaking, Rahul, we're going to see what the RSS thinks of this book, right? My bet is that from a Hedgewarianism, I think the RSS has generally been very, very red-lined about it, right? I.e., there is our line, and it is Deshbhakti, right? Which is why the RSS does have, maybe in small numbers, I don't know the numbers, but it has Sikh groups, Buddhist groups, Christian groups, Muslim groups, right? It does.
Dalits.
Dalits,
Tribals.
right? So, tribals, yeah, exactly. It does a lot of work with the tribals.
In fact, its entire architecture.
Correct, right? Yeah. What is called broadly the Sangh Parivar.
Yeah.
It works in all of these fields.
Yes.
So to me, it's not creed. So let's just get rid of creed. To me, it's not even class because they work with tribals right the way through to businessmen, right? And chambers of commerces.
Yes.
So it's not class, right? Now, so then let's come to creed. Well, again, as we said, they seem to have these bridging motions everywhere. So again, it doesn't look like... So in that sense, they've stuck true to Hedgewarianism, right? But I think here people get confused. That I think what's happened is when in the early phases of the RSS, Hedgewar did not want the RSS to be hijacked or subverted by political nationalists. So he kept the RSS away from all political groups, absolutely all. And he focused on the society, right? What they call broadly man-making. I would call it, in modern speak, social capital, right? Focus on social capital. So that's one. Now, as the time has gone by, inevitably, the RSS has grown.
Yes.
Rashtra is something that they've now got a handle on. And so naturally, a lot of Swayamsevaks, a lot of Karyakartas, these people will say, well, this is great, social capital is great, but what about the Rajya? So those people have become, they've left cultural nationalism, they've become political nationalists. We call that the BJP, right? So the BJP is a politically nationalist movement. The RSS still, I think, remains a culturally nationalist movement. Now, sadly, I think, and it's a hypothesis, I don't know, I think people both within the RSS and without the RSS get confused. And there are those that don't know when you're meant to be culturally nationalist and what is political nationalism. So I think a lot of the stuff that you just mentioned a moment ago, I think comes out of political nationalism, right? It does not come out of Hedgewarianism. So this is the key.
Right. So with Narendra Modi or Atal Bihari Vajpayee or Advani, etc., at one point, and Amit Shah, etc., who sort of traced their origins back into the RSS, do you think there's more of a bridge now between the cultural nationalists and the political nationalists, and there is beginning to be a continuity in thought and in political outlook?
Yeah, look, the way I would say it is the sun and the moon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The moon doesn't project its own light.
Should we be optimistic? Do you think the twains will meet in a manner that reconciles both and projects this country down the road of an inclusive India rather than, as some people have said, a Hindu Pakistan?
If India adopts cultural nationalism, it will be an inclusive, liberal, plural democracy.
Right.
That's how Hedgewar would have envisaged it, and that's how Hedgewarianism inevitably leads you down. However, if you allow the Rajya to dictate terms, shape the narratives, shape the conversation, it will have entrenchments. You will get ghettoization of thought, and of mind, and therefore society. So I would say that politics has its place. It does have its place.
Yeah.
And to battle for the
And it
Rajya...
has its impulses.
It has its impulses.
Yeah.
But if the RSS remains a culturally nationalist movement, and it mostly focuses on uplifting the society from class and creed, and build social capital, then I don't think Indian democracy has anything to worry about. If anything, I think it will become an incredible bastion of how do you bring democratic values to 1.4 billion people.
Well, Sachin Nandha, wonderful speaking to you, because this is something that I have concluded also in a book that I've written. And it's wonderful to find that there is somebody else who has dug deep and come up with the same sort of outlook. And it's an optimistic one. And let's just hope that those who are listening from the political side of the fence also get once again reintroduced to Hedgewarism in case they're beginning to lose their path. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Wonderful
so much.
speaking to you.
Real pleasure.
Wonderful.